Hi, my name is Veronica Ortiz. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I get to train you today on the topic of interpersonal trauma and what we can do to help. This is going to be a tough journey, right? Because I'm going through this on Zoom. I don't get to see you, I don't get to interact with you. So please bear with me as we go through this. By trade, as a social worker, I'm used to working with people. I'm used to feeding off of their energy. I'm used to really being able to engage with them and be present. So this is going to be a very new experience for me. Please bear with me if I kind of, struggle with this. But what I'm excited to do is simply is working with Menti. When I heard about what it is that you guys do, the reach that you have, the span at which you can help people, I was instantly sold. And as I spoke with Letitia about really helping the mentors understand who they're working with on a deeper, more fundamental level, I was able to come up with just an idea of just let's just talk about trauma, right? Let's talk about how it affects people, how exposure even early on affects us and later on in life. My experience over the past 10 years has taken me down several different avenues at which I have worked with individuals in terms of interpersonal trauma. I've worked with kids in child welfare. I've worked with unaccompanied, undocumented minors as they came into the country. I've worked with teens in residential, and now I'm working in back of the yard in back of the yards in Brighton Park, really working with school-based counselors who are kind of in the school, and I'm exposed to kids in gangs. I'm exposed to all sorts of things. So trauma is what I do, right? It's what I know. It's what I do, and I'm excited to kind of share that with you in hopes that the more awareness that you have, the more effective you can be, the more secure you can feel in helping others, right? I feel like the more you know, the better, the easier it is for you to um, hold people's experiences, right? How do you bear witness to somebody's experience and hold that? And having a really good understanding of trauma really helps that. So today we are going to do what I call the Trauma 101 training. So we're going to do that. Um, we're going to talk a little bit about some neurobiological things. It just kind of helps understand how we hold trauma. We're going to talk about trauma PTSD in and of itself. We're going to talk about early adverse childhood experiences, and we're going to close it up with what we can do. As we go through this, please have pen and paper handy. You can pause right now to go make sure you have a pen and paper handy with you, because I want you to write down questions. I want you to write down your curiosities. I want you to even write down if some of this might trigger you a little bit, right? This is some tough content as you kind of understand the trauma. Something could trigger you. So I want you to be mindful of that. Listen to your body, listen to your mind, um, and write it all down. And bring it with you on Monday, November 16th, when we get together. And that way I give you all the content that I want to train you on the front end. You can watch it, process it, and then when we meet, you can ask questions. You can even ask me questions ahead of time via email. I'll share that at the end of our meeting, and uh, we will be able to go in a little deeper about this and really talk about how it looks like in those that you're working with. So um, I get really geeked out about this. So if I go too fast, I'm going to ask you to have to like rewind a little bit. Because I think the more I get into it, the faster I'll talk, but I will be very mindful about that. So make sure you have your pen and paper handy, because here we go with Trauma 101. I am now going to share my screen. And we go into present view. There we go. So, like I said, as just to be aware is that this could trigger you a little bit. This could bring up some stuff. Please be mindful. Take breaks as you need to go. And I'm here to answer any questions and help in any way. Like I said, at the end of the video, I will share my email address with you all so you can reach out to me. So let's talk about trauma. Let's talk about trauma. What is it, right? We hear it. It's often used in different ways. It's used in terms of physical trauma, right? You go into a car accident, that's physical trauma. It's an actual abrupt experience that you might have, right? We know that trauma. The way we're going to talk about trauma today is very interpersonal, right? We're going to be talking about it in the context of the individual. We can start by just defining it, right? What is trauma, right? And trauma is when a person has experienced or witnessed an event or events that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to physical integrity, self or others, in which involved fear, helplessness, or horror has occurred. Let's kind of break that down a little bit. I'm going to use our little handy little pointer here. Let's talk about the fact that we're talking about an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury, okay? Even in the situation that you did not experience the entire trauma, if you have had the experience where you actually feared death, it can have just the same effects as if you had actually gone through the whole physical part of it. The brain really absorbs these experiences and reacts to them. When we're looking at threat to physical integrity or self or others, right? That's when we kind of start thinking about physical abuse, restraints, captivity, or really kind of fall into those patterns of my entire self is being affected by this. And when we have this intense fear and helplessness and horror, the chemicals in our brain misfire, right? We're just going to completely fire cortisone, which is our fight or flight response chemical in our brain, hormone. And as it misfires, our body just is in an alert state. It's on edge, right? And just kind of think back. If you have experienced something that has been threatened to that level, then you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who have not, just think about times where you might have almost gotten into an accident, right? You're driving in your car and you almost rear-end the person in front of you. And what happens is that you immediately clench, right? You clench the steering wheel, you get stiff, and that's cortisol that's literally flooding your body to prepare for impact. Regardless if you're going to hit or not, your brain, your body prepared for impact. In that position, you got stiff, you got aware, you usually kind of perspirate a little because your body's getting ready to respond to this. That's the cortisol that's just pretty much flowing through your body and kind of preparing you for that. When we experience trauma, we're in that state. And what happens is, and what we would like to happen is that after the trauma, we want that to go down, right? We want to calm ourselves down. We're like, oh, whew, I did not get into that accident. Thank God. Okay, I'm safe. I can evaluate my safeness and come down. You might feel a little jittery a little bit out, but you're able to bring yourself down. When we're talking about this trauma, we're talking about really staying in that state and what that's like. So let's talk about what goes on in the brain. Okay. Let's just kind of take a look at the brain. The brain is a very complex system. It's one of the most fascinating machines on the face of our earth. And we have created some pretty awesome machines, but the way that the brain functions is the most fascinating. And we're learning about it every day. For this training, we are really going to focus in on the center part of our brain, which we would call the limbic system. Okay. This part of the system is really all about how we perceive information. We're constantly taking in information, what we see, what we smell, what we touch, what we taste, and all of that is really housed in this part of the brain. So we're still using our little pointer. So we're looking here. You got the hippocampus, which is right here. It's really about the size of a nickel. but it holds a lot of information, right? So that's our short-term memory information, how we hold it. It's kind of like the filing cabinet that we have for information. Right above it, over here, we've got the amygdala, right? And our amygdala is our fight, flight, or freeze system. Okay, this is the one that could push the pituitary gland, which is right here, to push out that cortisol, right? This is the dashboard that says, hey, we're not doing well. Let's prepare for a fight. And so this is where the amygdala is. And then we've got the orbital frontal cortex, which is right here in the front of the brain. You know, if you look at any helmet that you put on, it always protects the front of your head. And that's because it houses a very important part of your head. Other than the fact that it's your executive functioning that tells you that it's not a good idea to jump off of a 2-story building, it also holds our emotional and social experiences. This is how we learn how to interact with others. It kind of comes in this end. This is why teenagers are so awkward, right? This part of the brain is the last part to develop in our lifehood, and that's keeps on developing well into your 23 to 25. Usually men kind of develop a little later, so they're usually kind of developing till their mid-20s, and girls tend to finish developing about 23. But this part of the brain houses that emotional center. How do we interact with the world? These three are really important to understand because they really affect how we interact with others, right? If this is our memory bank, right, we have a memory bank here that is so close to these other parts of the brain that really affect how we interact with others, how we establish relationships. Our fight, flight, or freeze response is all kind of happening in this part of the brain. Then one of them is going to react to the other very quickly. And so we're really going to talk about that as we go on, but just wanted to give you an image of the brain as we talk about it. So bear with me as we go into the neurobiological parts of trauma. So in the previous screen, I showed you the hippocampus, right? The hippocampus, which really is responsible for storing our memories in our brain. I want you to kind of start to think about it also in the course of child development, right? As a child develops, if the hippocampus is maladaptive in a sense, it's going to affect how the child interacts with the world as far as what they remember and how they interact with the world. So what we know is that traumatized individuals may be adversely affected by negative memories, which affects their learning. Their concentration could be impacted. This is why that part of the brain, when that part of the brain is really heightened in terms of our memory bank, our brain can't settle. So we have nightmares and intrusive thoughts, right? We probably can't sleep because it's all connected. And if our memory bank is constantly functioning, we're not going to be able to rest very well. Our temporal lobe, which wasn't on the other one, but it's right here, right behind our eyes. That has some really importance, some big importance in terms of how we process trauma. It's our memory, our orientation of self in space and time. So if I have been held captive, locked in a closet, if I have not been able to leave my home, or I'm tied up, right? That part of the brain is now functioning in terms of how I understand space. So once I'm released from captivity, my understanding of space is going to be really affected. So that's why it's important to understand kind of how our temporal lobe works. It's also responsible with processing information that we see, as well as hear, smell, even language, right? Which is why sometimes you're walking down in a department store and you smell a cologne or the perfume of your ex and you're immediately triggered, right? It's going through the temporal lobe. It's going in through this part. It goes directly into our hippocampus, and the memories start flooding through our minds. That's how that works. In the brain slide, as we see here, the amygdala, right? We talked about it. It's our switching system. It's our command center that takes in this information and says, you go here, you go here, you go here, you go here. And really it talks about that sending information to our frontal cortex, this part of our brain. So if we have these maladaptive behaviors or we have this trauma early on in life, that amygdala is misfiring, right? It may send fight, flight, or freeze responses when it's not really necessary because it's been damaged. It doesn't really know how to interact. So that's why we tend to see people who have been traumatized tend to be hyper aroused. They're overly sensitive, resulting in extreme alertness, right? Sometimes it's come off as aggressive, and kind of sensitive to how others interact. You know, if you've ever been around somebody who's like, all right, you know, like they like jump, you're like, whoa, you know, I wasn't doing anything. You're like, whoa, calm down, you know. That has a lot to do with a trauma response, right? I'm constantly on edge because I don't feel safe, right? So if I'm traumatized, my amygdala is misfiring. It doesn't really understand. Um, and then since we have fight, flight, or freeze, right? The freeze aspect is the part where it's like I can have a delayed response to something. I can just kind of like sit there, not really know what to do because my amygdala is not really knowing where to process this information. I don't feel safe, so let's just assess the situation until I can figure it out. That's our freeze response. And the amygdala could just tell you, let's hijack out of here. And that's our flight response, right? So these are, I'm hoping as we talk about these things, these kind of things that are kind of coming up in terms of who you're working with, that you're like, oh, this could be the thing, right? It's really also important that we know that early childhood trauma definitely affects an adult's ability to concentrate, take in new information, learn, shift from one way of thinking to the other. It's very hard because they've been misfiring for so long, right? Awesome. So we talked about the orbital frontal cortex, which is kind of the whole section, but let's just kind of talk about the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive functioning. Okay, this is the part of the brain that tells us that we start learning to develop where if I spend all my money, I can't pay rent. It's very experiential in its development. I start learning about these long-term consequences. I start thinking a little bit further into my future. I can think 3, 5 years in advance where, you know, children really struggle to think abstractly. They really struggle to think about next week, much less 2 years from now. So if this is the part of the brain that's very connected to these other parts of these hypersympathetic parts of the brain, it's going to be affected in our cognitive experiences, in who we are as a person, our personality expression, which is often genetic, but can be mutated and changed and shifted with experiences early on. So that part of the brain can be affected. We talked about decision making, our social behavior, right? If I don't trust others, I'm gonna have a really hard time building safe, healthy relationships as I go on. Um, this brain region is considered to be the orchestration of thoughts and actions in accordance with internal goals. A healthy development of this part of the brain would be able to understand, okay, um, I want to be able to go to the mall this weekend with my friends. So I'm going to behave extra good, right? I'm going to be on my best behavior to get there, right? That's what I'm saying as far as this is the part of the brain that starts to connect those things. Like if I do certain things happen. And so it's within trauma that that part of the brain doesn't function very well. And when you start working with people who have been exposed to really grave traumas, you find that their decision making is very poor. You're just like, why do you keep doing that? Why do you keep dating the same type of guys? Why can't you get it together? Well, that's probably been affected in their brain. Um, Sometimes there's a maladaptive response to trauma, right? And they could be out of control of what we would consider to be socially inappropriate. Could be um, because this is how they've learned how to interact, right? And we definitely see that with particularly what we see is young boys who are exposed to domestic violence. Um, Sometimes, not often, that's a misconception, but sometimes begin to repeat those behaviors because that's all they know. This is what they know, so this is what they do, even though they know it's socially unacceptable. all has to do with the brain. So I want us to kind of take a minute to kind of think about some of the considerations about what it is that we're talking about. Okay. Um, when we think about children, and their frontal lobes, this part of this entire front part of the brain that I mentioned is the last in its development. If it's not fully developed, or even have healthy development, um, it could affect their adolescent and adult lives, right? And then children exposed to repeated trauma don't have the capacity to process experiences in a sophisticated way, right? They just don't have the capacity to do it. And you can start to develop a mentality of the world is not safe. And with that, it's going to affect how you interact with others, how you build relationships, how you can maintain a job, right? All of this is going to be affected by these experiences. In my experience working with adults who have been exposed to trauma, they're if an adult is exposed to trauma, not in early childhood, but as an adult, they have some life experiences, some capacity to comprehend the situation and compartmentalize what happened, right? I was a person in a situation, I didn't cause it, but I'm greatly affected by it, right? A car accident, I could even say a rape, right? If somebody is raped, in adulthood, yes, it fractures their entire psyche, their entire sense. Um, but they have some prior life experience that kind of carries them through it. Hopefully they have positive relationships that can help them overcome it. But that's the difference between how trauma can affect an adult versus a child, right? It's just that lack of support. And we're going to talk later on about caregiving roles and how important those are. I hope you're keeping up. This would be a good time to pause, rewind if you need to. But let's just keep trucking on. All right. Thanks for bearing with me. Some other considerations that we can talk about is adults traumatized as children, right? Are going to have trouble forming and maintaining relationships because simply their brains have not been able to develop. If our social functioning is here in the front, my decision making is here in the front, but my amygdala and my hippocampus are misfiring, I don't really know if you're safe. I may just distrust everyone, or I may just trust everyone because, well, it seems like everyone's going to hurt me and that's just what they do. So I'm just going to easily have these fluid boundaries with people, which we don't want either, right? We want people to have healthy boundaries, but you can either have rigid or fluid boundaries with people that neither one. You don't want either one. You may develop inappropriate ways to deal with people in your lives, right? You may lash out at people. You may have aggressive responses. If you've ever, I always go back to dating, right? I just feel like that's just kind of something that happens. But as you date, you've dated somebody like, whoa, you've got issues. That has a lot to do with it, right? What were their childhood experiences like? Back when I was dating, I would ask, of course, a little while in, but I would definitely ask, like, what's your trauma experiences like, right? I think they tell me a lot about why you are who you are right now, right? How you function. Abuses children, adults who lack secure attachment may become avoidant of establishing relationships or overly dependent on others. And that dependency on others is more common than the avoidance. That's where we start to have this codependent mentality. Either I need you to meet my needs, or I need you to be dysfunctional so that I can fix you and meet my needs. It can get really complicated. And I think we'd have to talk about therapy 101 to talk about that part. In addition, very well known people who have experienced trauma and are struggling to manage their emotions oftentimes do turn to substance abuse or self-injurious behavior. Eating disorders are very common, but it's definitely something that you see. You also see mental health challenges such as depression, anxiety, usually severe anxiety. Bipolar disorder is very common. Some personality disorders can develop from exposure to trauma. So we definitely we see this. We see this every day. Anytime you work with somebody who's exposed to trauma, I'm telling you, you're like, whoa, I see it. I see it. I see it. So we can talk about trauma as a thing, but then let's just kind of talk about PTSD, right? Which is what we definitely hear about. It's synonymous with, war exposure, rape victims, refugees, right? Immigrants, right? PTSD is something that we are able to hear about, but it's actually a little bit more complex than it kind of comes off as. To have a diagnosis of PTSD, you have to have these 4 things. You have to be experiencing intrusive thoughts, emotions, or images, right? We talked about the amygdala misfiring, our hippocampus not working. So we may have some intrusive thoughts. We may have some nightmares. We may have these moments of being triggered where something just kind of these memories flood your brain and you feel unsafe. And you feel like you're in that situation all over again. That re-experiencing is really a big thing. Avoidance and or numbing. We call it dissociation. So where it's kind of where you just kind of disconnect from yourself and you're kind of either you hear a lot of people talk about, I blacked out. I don't remember what happened, or I froze, or I kind of felt like I was outside of my body and I was floating over myself. These are all different forms of dissociation, very common in trauma responses. And we hear a lot about it in terms of, I can't remember pieces of the traumatic event. Well, yeah, that's the brain protecting itself. We talked about that hyperarousal, right? We talked about the hippocampus kind of being like, whoa, 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 whoa. The amygdala being like, whoa, we're not okay. So we're going to flood you with this safety hormone, cortisol, which might make you be like you're on alert, you're jumpy, fidgety, you may have panic attacks. It might come off as being irritable, but you could just be irritable because you can't sleep, right? Like I can't blame somebody for being irritable, for not being able to sleep or not feeling well. So that's definitely an issue. And then finally, it's usually accompanied with some sort of body symptoms, right? They'll usually kind of talk about severe headaches, stomach aches, trouble breathing, right? Our body does respond to what's going on in the brain. So these are all very common. You have to have these top 3 things. The bottom one, not necessarily, but you have to have those 3 things to be diagnosed with PTSD. You can also be diagnosed with acute traumatic stress disorder, but we're not going to talk about that. We're just not. It's just going to make this even longer. So something that has kind of come up in the last 20 years or so is the idea of complex and chronic trauma. So when we talk about PTSD, it's usually happening in terms of either one event or maybe a couple of events that have led for you to have these symptoms and experiences, right? We know that war exposure, it creates PTSD, these kinds of things. But as it turns out, there are different levels of trauma exposure, and they kind of look differently in different phases of our life. So complex trauma I want to talk about because it's something that we're going to see a lot in the populations that we're working with. And it really occurs most often involving direct harm, exploitation, and maltreatment. By primary caregivers, okay? Or whoever's the responsible adult for you. So you've kind of experienced these traumatic events at the hands of your caregiver or at the neglect of your caregiver. And it then creates a different response to your world around you. My primary caregiver hurts me. And so now how do I interact with other people in the world? Like I said, it often occurs in developmentally vulnerable times, which is usually childhood or adolescence. It can occur in adulthood, particularly if the adult is dependent on somebody else. So we definitely see it with people who are handicapped, have developmental disorders, or for some reason have to rely on someone else. But that reliance on a caregiver and that caregiver hurting you is the basis of complex trauma. So we definitely see it. We see the same symptoms that we saw in PTSD and complex trauma. These kind of tend to be a little bit more intrusive in nature. The nightmares are definitely more intrusive. We have trouble establishing relationships. We have major attachment issues. And it just seems to be more severe. The response and the symptomology of it is more severe than we see in just traditional PTSD. Like I said, complex trauma, and we'll talk a little bit about chronic trauma, but that it happens particularly when it's happening by somebody in a caregiver role. What I want to really hit home with is that with complex trauma, that traumatic event, that traumatic experience does not end when the trauma ends. It doesn't end when the abuse ends. It doesn't end when the domestic violence or assault ends or the neglect ends. And that's really what we have to understand, that the complex trauma is something that you're kind of carrying with you, almost like a backpack, or like actually wounds and scars that we see is that kids have now are in that same state of arousal 20, 30 years, 40 years old. We're still carrying those same responses. That's the complex trauma. We're not having the bounce back of safety, right? Like I said about earlier, when I said earlier about the trauma exposure, and if you can regroup after your traumatic event, regroup, find a sense of safety, stabilize yourself, you're less likely to establish maladaptive behaviors, and that PTSD is likely to go away. You can be cured of PTSD. Complex trauma, on the other hand, when it's been at the hands of my caregiver and it's been, like I said, intrusive in nature, you carry it with you through adulthood, and oftentimes complex trauma ends up going down to your kids. It's cyclical in nature in a lot of ways, but that's where complex trauma, we see it a lot, particularly in kids who are sexually abused, physically abused, that neglect, kids who are born in refugee camps, right? It's just this early on experience that is now affecting through adulthood. So we're going to just dabble a little bit into chronic trauma. So chronic trauma is just something that may happen over and over and over, right? So we see that with domestic violence. We see that in prisoners of war. I just said and I wrote but chronic trauma might apply in cases of ongoing abuse, neglect, domestic violence, human trafficking. Human trafficking is a big one. But it's something that happens, like I said, over and over. It may not be the same trauma. They may be similar traumas, or you could have experienced the entire implosion of your life where you were diagnosed with cancer, and you're dealing with that, and then you got into a severe car accident, and so now you have to go to physical therapy for that. And then your brother died, and you're dealing with that. These are these different layered traumas that are happening in the same amount of time. So it's still like several events happening, so that you can also be exposed to chronic trauma. Much like complex trauma, those symptoms and what we see after are very similar. It's very intrusive in nature, and it's very hard to start breaking apart what life was like. You've now created a new psyche, and you have to unlearn what you've learned in your trauma. It's a huge pattern of unlearning what that abuse did to you. It's unlearning versus a PTSD exposure. You're not, for example, veterans, right? They went to war and they had these experiences of killing others or witnessing others or seeing their brethren be killed. Then they come home and they're like, okay, I understand I was in war. They can have these processes that says, I'm okay, I'm safe, I'm in it. Where these experiences of complex and chronic trauma, like I said, even after the trauma, I'm still in it. And you can have PTSD and complex trauma. Again, that's a whole other training. But I'm hoping this is giving you some idea as far as what it is that we're working with. So I just kind of want to talk a little bit on traumatic experiences with our refugees and our immigrant communities. You know, just the entire process of having to leave your home country is a traumatic experience. It's an experience of displacement, and that's trauma in and of itself. Now, what's happening is that our refugees and our immigrants are not exactly leaving, sunshine and rainbows and fairy tales, right? They're leaving what are already probably traumatic events in and of themselves. So they're coming with us with already several different types of traumas, right? That they've already suffered that have led to them wanting to flee their countries. So now we're talking about some of that chronic trauma, right? This different layered things of I'm not safe at home. Uh, there's violence in my community. So that's community violence. I'm being separated from family, right? So we're having different layers of that. And it's really hard to start pulling those layers apart when we look at the complexity of the brain and how it's interpreting that information. But it's hard to work with this particular population, the refugee and immigrant population, because it's not like you're identifying just one traumatic event. It's just a plethora of traumatic events that have kind of transpired to this point. Some of the things that I've encountered, particularly when I worked with refugees at Heartland Alliance, is that they came to me already having experienced imprisonment, some of them torture, loss of property. I worked with one family who just had everything taken away from them. Malnutrition is very common, physical assault, extreme fear, rape, and loss of livelihood. Just those things are all signs of PTSD, right? All can lead to PTSD, that kind of exposure. And then we just talk about their trip here, right? Their flight here, and what that might be like. That voyage is a traumatic one. It's a scary one. It's life-threatening. And that could be really difficult. That's where we see a lot of separation of families. Obviously, we're seeing that in the border now. And what that does, right, to the human mind. It's just a type of agony, particularly when you're working with parents, that they've experienced that separation. And then you've got kids who have been separated from their caregivers. When I worked also at Heartland Alliance, I also worked with the unaccompanied minors who were either separated from their parents or their parents literally sent them here on their own. And they just talked about the from sexual assault to being trafficked, the things that happened to them in order to get here, and the sacrifices they made. Like those are traumatic in nature, right? And then perhaps the most significant effects from all of this experience is having been betrayed by either your own people, by enemy forces, or by the politics of their own world in general, right? That sense of hopelessness really messes with the brain. Hopelessness is one of the worst things that you can experience. Hope is a powerful thing. And when you don't have it, it's a very dark time. So I'm hoping, again, let's just kind of revisit some of the stuff that we're talking about. This particular thing is not new to you, but kind of understanding what lies behind it, the multi-layered, multifaceted aspect of trauma. I hope that's definitely being drilled in. So we're going to talk about ACEs next. Those are adverse childhood experiences. Many of you may have already heard about the ACEs study. It came out in the 90s, and it was a longitudinal study of people, different walks of life. And they surveyed thousands. And what they were looking at and measuring were these experiences, which are adverse childhood experiences, and the longitudinal effects of them. And the survey itself is really focusing on traumatic events that you might have experienced before the age of 18. It includes abuse and neglect, parental illness, substance use, divorce, incarceration, and domestic violence. It's a 10-question survey. It's a really quick survey, but it found a huge link between those with high numbers of ACEs and those who had issues of poor physical health, particularly heart disease, diabetes, substance use, often had issues of with the law, right? They're just directly linked in terms of that. And the more ACEs that you've experienced, these adverse childhood experiences, the greater risk for these outcomes. As we look here on the right, kind of take a look. This is the triangle that came out with their study. This is how they put it down. And so it's just a matter of the more ACEs you have in conception, the likelihood that these things are going to happen. So generational embodiment, which is historical trauma, right? So even if my family has already experienced these things, definitely see them with refugee population and immigrant population. My family has experienced great trauma to get me here, or I've experienced great trauma. That's already an adverse childhood experience, right? Social conditions, what I grew up like. We see a lot of people who live in urban areas that are high with community violence. This definitely affects them. So this is just underneath the adverse childhood experiences as we talk about how it affects them. And we kind of go on. If this has been impaired and this has been impaired and this has been impaired, then disrupted neural development, social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behavior. Like this is what the study found, that each one leads to the next one. And what I've known in my practice, and I've seen this firsthand, is how adverse childhood experiences affect us in adulthood. I can speak for that on personal level, on the level at which of those I've worked with. It is huge. And when you look at it in terms of that, we can kind of see those things. And when we think about our own ACEs, right? And that's the divorce of our parents, separation, the death of a parent. These are all these experiences that affect us into adulthood and affect our functioning. Really big. So when we think about that in terms of who we're working with, the more adverse childhood experiences those who we work with have, the riskier, the more challenges they're going to have in adulthood, right? It's just what we know. So let's get out of this darkness and kind of into what we can do, right? What can you do to help? So you're building these relationships with people. You're building relationships with those who have had several adverse childhood experiences, who have had adult adverse experiences. What can we do, right? Other than helping them meet their needs or reach their goals, being with them can be really challenging. It can be really hard to hold all of that. So let's just kind of talk about that a little bit. What does creating a safe space look like? It's something that we hear all the time, safe space. But there's some things that need to be in place for it to be a safe space. Obviously, being free of abuse and neglect is the number one thing, right? As long as that's on your forefront, that there is no abuse and neglect in the relationship, that's a huge piece to having safe space and safe relationships. These are three things that I believe in, right? I believe that these three things need to be in place to create safe space with somebody who has had high trauma exposure. And that's, first things first, is unconditional positive regard. The people who we're working with cancel appointments. They say they're going to do something, they don't follow through. They may even blow up at us sometimes. They may feel like you don't understand them. Um, they may be rigid with your ideas, right? The best thing you can do is provide that unconditional positive regard, which means that you're showing complete support and acceptance regardless of what they do. No matter how many times they don't answer when you call, no matter how many times they disregard you, you're still there, right? How many times they frustrate you, and maybe you set something up for them and they didn't show up, you're still there because you understand. You're trauma informed now, right? At this point in our presentation, you have now become trauma informed. So the lens at which you work with people is going to be a trauma informed lens. You're now understanding that they are functioning from a place of deficiency in so many ways: emotional deficiency, psychological deficiency, physical deficiency. You have that lens now to understand that. So your role now is to have that unconditional positive regard. Urge confidentiality. Those that we're working with don't trust us, right? And we have a lot of ground to make up for that we didn't break. We didn't break that trust, but we have a lot to do. Always, in any opportunity that you have when you're working that, just remember that what we talk about, what we do, is confidential, right? There is some responsibility that you might have in terms of being a mandated reporter, and that's if you hear of any abuse that might be happening to a child or somebody who is unable to take care of themselves, you are responsible to report that. That's when you break confidentiality. Obviously, if the person tells you that they want to hurt themselves, you break confidentiality and call 911. So we'll talk a little bit more about that on Monday. Empathic listening. This is one that if you don't practice it, I believe you have to practice it. You practice it in your personal life, in your work life, and as well as in your mentoring relationships. Empathic listening is when you focus and you listen to understand and not to fix or respond, right? Which is really hard. It's really hard for some of us if we've never practiced it. We definitely want to be there. Your response is not necessary sometimes. You just kind of want to listen to understand and not to fix or respond. You don't have to fix your problems, nor do you have the magic wand that you need to fix them. They come with their own baggage, a lot of stuff, but what we can do in our time with them is help them identify new options, new horizons, find ways for them to be stable enough to address all those issues. Like if they're not in a place of safety, they can't get to where they want to get to, right? So that's really important. It's really important to stay in the moment. Don't get ahead of yourself, right? When you're working with someone, our brain sometimes starts going, okay, so then you need to do A, B, C, D, and E to fix this. That might be really hard for the traumatized individual. Three-step advice is really hard. Start with one step. If they can manage that, you might do 2 steps, right? So if you're trying to give them directives and it's like, you need to get to this job interview at 3:30. You might need to bring it back to them and be like, okay, your interview's at 3:30. You need to be ready by 2, at the bus stop by 2:45. This is where it's located. Like, you're gonna have to break some of that down for them, because if you give them a lot at first, it can overwhelm them and they could check out. We're gonna talk a little bit more about this on Monday, but just kind of think about that as you interact with folks. And this is really how you create a safe space, because you want them to feel comfortable being vulnerable with you. Accompaniment. What does that mean? What does it mean to accompany someone, right? Like, we know that a company is usually used in terms of orchestra and symphonies. But when we're looking at relationship building, I really want us to hone in on this in terms of how we connect to others. Uh, Observation is one of the biggest tools that we have in our repertoire. We observe, we are constantly observing. We observe people, and we are both observed as well as we observe. It's one of our biggest communication skills. We see, that's how we see things, and understand that the same way that we're observing somebody, they're observing us. So what we put out into the universe is also really important. Our body language is really important. And initial observations give us a very partial sense of context, right? If you see from somebody just walking towards you, you start making these judgments. I mean, even though we strive not to be judgmental, we start making these thoughts, and we start putting these things together because that's what we see. But we have to take some time to also look a little past that, right? And that's taking time. So that's where we go to the next step, and that's noticing. Um, it, Practicing of critical, compassionate observation in which we're probing the connection between personal struggles and public issues, right? We're kind of looking at ways to help who we're working with and talking to connect that, like, oh, so do you think that might be connected with the fact that you didn't have anywhere to live for a long time? Like, kind of helping them have those connections so that they can be like, oh, well, yeah, that's why this is hard for me to do right now. And noticing in times entails attention to time as well as to people and place. When you notice things, hey, I can't help but notice like this is hard for you. The other person feels like you really pay attention to them and you're really listening. So that really goes a long way. And finally, bearing witness. Okay, bearing witness is one of the biggest privileges we have when working with somebody. It's them being able to share their story and you being able to hold it, right? We're present in the moment, and witness to another person's story or experience is huge. And they've allowed themselves to be vulnerable to share that with you. Be in the moment with them about that. Bear witness to their story. We can do that by just observing, by listening. We can even document it, right? Like, hey, I kind of want to write this down so that we can kind of talk about it later. You can definitely do that. But it's really staying in the moment of experiencing something through somebody else's eyes, right? Bearing witness can also require some uncomfortable silence. Um, there's power in silence. Uh, it allows for some room and breathing, but you have to use it very sparingly because silence can be very triggering for someone. So just kind of being mindful of what kind of cadence you use when you talk to others really affects bearing witness. But we'll talk a little bit more about that on Monday. Last but not least, self-care. Um, you need to be in a good health headspace to help others. It's just that simple. You need to have it. I found my 3 favorite um, kind of pictures that I have on my self-care plan at my office. I'm not at my office right now, but I actually have these up. Um, you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to have something to give. And those that you're working with are so vulnerable and so dry for resources that they need you to be at your best. So really being mindful of that, taking care of yourself. You got to feed goodness into yourself, and then having a self-care plan that includes some of these things here on the right. Taking time for yourself, staying hydrated, putting your health first, like these kinds of things are really important to be with others. So that's all, folks. Thank you for staying with me through this point of the presentation. Like I said, any questions you have, please write them down and share them with me. I did not put a slide with my information, but I will do that right now. We're going to add a slide right here. And this is my email address for those of you. Meadow.ortiz 1018 gmail.com. You can always call me 773-558-3353. Finally, there's always work. I want you to have several options on how to reach me. Thank you for your time. I look forward to meeting each and every one of you on Monday. Please come ready with your questions. Email me your questions in advance if you want, and I can definitely come up with a quick, response, at least an informed response if I don't have it. So uh, let me know. I hope you enjoyed this. Rewind, go back, and whatever you need to cover, and we will discuss it more on Monday. So I will see you then. Thanks, everyone.